The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show. Not sure what is going on here. All right, a little technical glitch. Let me just try to see if I can solve this. Give me a second. It's affecting my capacity to do super chats. There's not more than one video live. All right. Give me a second. All right. Welcome to our Friday shows. Let's see. It's got that and that. All right. Let me see. All right. Let's see if I can. Hey, is this live? It's a mystery. Yes, it's live. Oh. All right. No video. Yes, I know. 1 second. All right. Okay. Sorry about all that. And I still don't have a solution. So let me just try to figure this out 1 second. I see why that is doing that. It's the first time. It's the first time for everything. And I don't know how to solve it. Damn. I wonder if I can stop this. Stop this video. Okay, I think I know what I need to do. Give me a second. Let me go there and shut that down. And let me, okay, live. Let's do that. And let's do delete. Stand, delete forever. All right. All right. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Welcome to Friday's show on the critics of capitalism. Me responding to the critics of capitalism. This is going to be a regular feature on Fridays. Not next week. Next week I'm traveling, so there will be no show next week. But the following week on Friday, we'll have another one of these. Now, usually, what I will do is I will show a video of a critic of capitalism, and we will analyze the video, and I will respond to the critique of capitalism. I also already have the video I want to do next lined up, and indeed I was going to do it today, but instead I decided to kind of shift track a little bit. I found out, right? I found out that earlier this month, on August 5th, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so a very prestigious encyclopedia run by Stanford University, again, in philosophy, so it's a philosophy encyclopedia, but very prestigious. Anyway, they published for the first time an entry on capitalism. And given kind of what we're doing here, and given that I knew it would be somewhat negative, I figured this would be a great opportunity to discuss what is actually written in the Stanford Encyclopedia. They have an entry on socialism, so but this is the entry on capitalism, they gave usually they appoint or they ask an author to come in and write the entry, and in this case, they chose a University of Chicago philosopher by the name of Chiara Cordelli, an Italian, but who works at the University of Chicago. I assume in the philosophy department. I think she's a political philosopher, and they asked her to write it. And here's the thing, right? Cordelli is a massive critic of capitalism. She has very little, if anything, positive to say about capitalism in her work. Her work is her work is, at least in the tradition of, I wouldn't say she's a Marxist, but she takes a lot of her concepts from Marx, and her work is dedicated to a critique of capitalism for the purpose of establishing an overwhelmingly socialist, what you would call democratic socialist, but socialist, and we'll see what they mean by democratic socialist. They don't mean by democratic socialist Sweden or Denmark. They mean by democratic socialism that everybody gets to vote on everything, right? So they mean the means of production are run democratically. Everything is run democratically, and investment is run democratically. We'll get to that. So here's the thing, right? So when they chose to write the section on socialism, they generally pick somebody sympathetic to socialism, and it comes across, and you can see in just the tone and the nature and the citations that are involved. I'll give you a statistic, right? Let me see if I can find this quickly. I've got a statistic here that's pretty alarming, right? Just to give you a general sense, right? So somebody, Phil Magnus and Caleb Pettit, published a review of the Stanford article on capitalism, and they did a little bit of analytical stuff, which Magnus is very good at, and he looked at all the people in all the citations. So there were 169 authors cited in the capitalist entry. So there's capitalism, and then there's a whole write-up. We'll go through the write-up, and then there's all these citations. More than half are hostile or critical of capitalism. Roughly 8% are supportive. Now, if you look at the socialism entry, right, the socialism article, which was published in 2018 and updated in 2024, of the 160 authors cited in the socialism article, so about the same number, only two are overtly critical of socialism, and nearly 2/3 were supportive. I mean, so I wondered, right, about the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I went to look at the entry for Ayn Rand, and there's a lot to criticize about the entry for Ayn Rand, but I have to say the entry for Ayn Rand is 100 times better than the entry in Capitalism. They picked somebody who is not hostile to Ayn Rand, somebody friendly. I don't think she really understands Ayn Rand. I don't think she's has a complete understanding of it, and she's definitely not a supporter of objectivism, but is somebody who studied it and has some sympathy towards it, kind of a libertarian philosopher who's somewhat sympathetic towards Ayn Rand. And a lot of the citations are people, who are objectivists, and it's not a great presentation of Ayn Rand's philosophy, but it's not horrible in the same sense as it's not obviously hostile. The entry in Capitalism is obviously hostile, and I'll show you how. The entry begins with Marx, presents his long disputed theory of exploitation without giving readers any standard objections, economic or moral, and repeatedly subjects capitalism's defenders, when they describe them, to rebuttals. The critics of capitalism don't get rebuttals. The defenders of capitalism get rebuttals left and right. I mean, the very assumption, the whole way in which this is written is, yeah, we all know capitalism's wrong. We all know capitalism is a bad system. There's something really horrific. There's something really bad about capitalism. I'm going to explain to you I'm going to give you some background about how I'm going to give a little bit of lip service to the defenders. And then we're going to get into kind of all the different ways in which it's being criticized by all kinds of people in all kinds of directions. And again, we will see that. Now, you could say, okay, I mean, this is just one scholar writing an article on capitalism. And that's true. I mean, if it was just her writing an essay, okay, this is her view of capitalism. Take it or leave it. But this is Stanford. This is Stanford selected the author. Stanford accepted the structure, accepted the content, and published it under the authority of an encyclopedia, a source of knowledge, a source of truth, hopefully. And yet Cordelli, in all of her work, clearly believes that capitalism is wrong and that it needs to be abolished. We need to move into a post-capitalist world, into ideally kind of depending on how socialist you want to go, about as socialist as it can get. So I want to look at her argument, look at the way she presented capitalism, not really argument. And then I was going to find a lecture by her. I was going to find a lecture by Cordelli on her critique of capitalism, so that we could analyze it. But the reality is that I found two, and one from Harvard and one from LSE, London School of Economics. But they are so academic and so technical that I decided it would drive me and you crazy to have to listen to it. I mean, I listened to one of the lectures in completion, and it was just too difficult. So I've got a couple of clips from the Q&A at the LSE, and we could discuss them if we have time and there's interest. But I thought what we do instead is just go over the article, go over the encyclopedia article. So I mean, here it is. Let me just find it for you. Yeah, you can see it right there. Right, that is the article. It says on the top, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And this was published in August 5th, 2026. So interesting that in article, in something about philosophy, capitalism, an important social, political, economic system, it's taken them until 2026 to publish something on this. See, there we go. You can see, I'm not sure, I'm trying to figure out what exactly you can see when I flip through this. Okay, I think that's good. So you can see basically what I am seeing. All right. So we're going to go over this. I'm going to read a few passages from it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Obviously, the whole thing is pretty long. I don't expect you to be reading off the screen, but partially I wanted to show you, because I want to show you just the volume of writing on the different topics. Like how much does she dedicate to Karl Marx versus how much does she dedicate to, I don't know, Hayek, Friedman, or Ayn Rand. Now, it's important to say this, right? There's a sense in which this all makes sense. And that sense is that this is not an encyclopedia of economics. This is an encyclopedia of capitalism, of philosophy. And the reality is that in philosophy, qua philosophy, there are almost no defenders of capitalism. If we think about philosophers, not economists who do some philosophical writing, I don't know, von Mises or Hayek, but we think about philosophers. Can you think about philosophers in the last 250 years? Philosophers who actually talk about, in a positive way, defend, make arguments for any kind of form of capitalism. So if you look at the philosophy, and I'd welcome to be corrected by the philosophers who on the show or on YouTube. So if you're reviewing, if you're a reviewer of if you're a reviewer that is reviewing a philosophical perspective on capitalism, then yeah, it's very, very, very limited and biased, right? You've basically got Nozick, the libertarian philosopher, and you've got Ayn Rand. And who else? I mean, if you want to think about the origins of capitalism as in private property, you could go to John Locke, but John Locke didn't really write about capitalism as a system, although it would be nice if he was mentioned at least in this article. Who else would you? I'm curious if anybody else has any ideas of philosophers written positively on capitalism. So if you look at the philosophy literature, what you get is overwhelmingly negative criticism. So it's somewhat understanding if you're writing an article for philosophy audience that you give weight to the philosophy content. And the philosophy content is, again, all negative. And I'm curious, I mean, Friedman defended capitalism, but he was not philosophical, he was not a philosopher. So I can understand them bracketing Friedman, and to some extent Hayek, and not even mentioning Mises, because they're economists. So that would be my only. It also tells you something, right? It tells you something about the state of a field. Here is a field, maybe the most important field of human knowledge, the foundational field of human knowledge, and has nothing really positive to say about a political, economic system. Let's call it just an economic system because that's how they view it, right? An economic system with massive political implications that has led to the wealth creation of the last 250 years. I mean, think about it. There is no other period in all of human history comparable with the last 250 years in terms of the material advancement of human life. Not even close, nowhere near. And it's recognized, even by the critics, that this is a period dominated in one way or another by capitalism. And while they all talk about capitalism is cyclical, it causes crisis, maybe, I mean, put that aside. Okay, but they also recognize that, and Marx certainly recognized this, that it's created enormous material wealth and changed the world in profound ways. And that all the profession of philosophy can do is to criticize the system, poke holes in the system, denigrate the system, challenge the system, and not try to look at it and say, human life is better in some meaningful way What's going on here? I mean, just as a curiosity, wouldn't you want to know? Here's how it begins. The case can be made that a more contested concept than capitalism does not exist. And I think to a large extent, she's right. It is an incredibly contested concept. And it's an incredibly important concept. But in the world in which we exist today, it has few defenders and almost no defenders in the field of philosophy. She says there is no agreement upon how or whether to define it. Now, I don't even know what the whether means. I mean, I understand that it's difficult, how to define it is difficult, but you'd think that you want to define all your terms, all your important terms. There is no agreement upon how or whether to define it. Many would identify capitalism with an economic system where productive assets are privately owned. Labor is hired for money wages through market contracts. Commodities are traded through exchanged markets. Markets govern allocation of resources between productive and other activities. Investment is largely in private hands, and production is oriented towards profit. I mean, it's fascinating how these people think. I mean, this is very much the way Marxists think. What is missing from this, for example? I mean, there's such a thing as productive assets, and they're utilized for profit. And in order to utilize them, labor is hired for money, okay? And all of that is market contracts. And the outcome, the product of the productive stuff is traded in market, exchanged in markets. And all these resources are governed by market phenomena. And investment is made privately. What is missing? What is missing here? And this, by the way, is missing from almost all discussions of capitalism, even by its supporters. I mean, no, there's trade here, right? Commodities are traded through exchange markets. That's there. And rights are not here. That's true. But in her own terms, they're identifying capitalism as an economic system. So put rights out of it, take rights for a second out of it, because rights are really a moral concept, not an economic concept. But what is missing from this economic system? There's even production, because she says where productive assets are privately owned and the production is oriented towards profit. But what's still missing? and this is the major flaw with almost everybody who talks about capitalism, What's missing is the entrepreneur. What's missing is the producer. The whole way in which Marx and his followers and most people in the world today think about markets and capitalism. The one entity that does not exist is, the Silicon Valley founder. You'd think it's right staring them right in the face, but it doesn't exist. He's just, I don't know, what is he? He's a productive asset, or where is he here? He's a laborer. He's not exactly a laborer. He doesn't fit into any of these categories. And yet, there are no productive assets other than maybe land without an entrepreneur. I mean, somebody had to create the steam engine. Somebody had to have the idea of using the steam engine in the production of textiles. Somebody had to have the idea of putting the steam engine on top of wheels and building a railroad system. They take all of that for granted. This is, and this is, by the way, this is Rand's genius, right? There've been others who've identified the entrepreneur. Maybe we'll get to that. We'll see how long this takes. But the reality is that Rand is the only one who fully appreciates that it is the genius, the work, the passion, the focus, the integrity of the producer that moves the world. And it is a producer. It's not the manual laborer. It is not markets, although markets are crucial, but markets are driven by producers at every single level. Entrepreneurs in arbitrage, in investment, in futures markets, in buying and selling, the merchant who's a buyer and seller of goods. All of them are crucial. But, it's just an abstraction, the market. But the market is made up of people, individuals, using their mind as individuals based on their values. But the thing that really drives us forward economically is the entrepreneur. And he has no place, it turns out, in capitalism. She goes on. However, each of these features, if taken separately, can be shown to have existed for a very long time. That's true. But what is she missing? She's exactly missing what has not existed for a very long time. So she says, however, each of these features, if taken separately, can be shown to have existed for a very long time, leaving open the question of what makes capitalism a historically distinctive economic system. What makes capitalism a historically distinctive economic system? Yes, I agree with him. We've had, in various times and places, productive assets have been in private hands. Land, for example. They've been different eras. Right? Labor is hired for money wages. That's happened before. Markets exist in exchanges. You can go to markets in the Middle Ages or even 3,000 years ago. Markets govern allocation between productive and other activities. To some extent, that's existed in the past, not completely. Investment is largely in private hands. Governors, kings have always dabbled in that, and production is oriented towards profit. What is unique about capitalism? Well, two things. One, that all of these things exist under capitalism all at once, and that is important. And second, that capitalism is the first system in human history where entrepreneurs flourish, where production driven by entrepreneurs flourishes. And then the question is why? What is it about capitalism that made it possible for all these things to exist at the same time, and innovation to explode, and entrepreneurs to be everywhere, and to and to invent and produce new things all the time, and to facilitate a system of sustained long-term economic growth, never seen before in all of human history. The only period of sustained long-term economic growth, something she never mentions, has been under capitalism, has been the last 250 years. So the question should be, okay, here's the system. It's got all these features. What makes that tick? What makes that happen? And then you can say, well, this is a period in which rights, have been relatively protected. This is a system of individual liberty and individual freedom, and that is what makes all these things able to happen at the same time. When people are free, when their rights are protected, they contractually arrange to work for a wage. When people are free, they invest largely in private hands. But no, I mean that would be thinking. That would be actual thinking. And the holes in the description, never mind everything else, are astounding. Then she goes on to say, further, there is disagreement as to whether capitalism can be reduced an economic system in the first place. Good for her. That is a good question. As some scholars have argued, capitalism may be understood as more than just a way of organizing the economy. I like this of organizing the economy. There's already a collectivistic and top-down implication there, right? Somebody organizes the economy. Capitalism may be understood as more than just a way to organize an economy. It is an institutionalized social order, a way of organizing society and its reproduction as a whole. I don't know what that means, but a way of organizing society, yes. As Ayn Rand said, it's a social system. She continues, the distinctive feature of this mode of social organization, in this view, includes a sharp separation of economic sphere from the political and social sphere. Or from the political sphere, I'm not sure what she means by the social sphere in terms of a separation. Economic activities, including relations of production and market exchange, are detached from familial, social, and political relations. Not if you run a family business, I guess. I don't. And presented as autonomous. Well, but are they really autonomous? For example, the political system has to at least protect property rights for there to be property rights, for there to be private property. So again, this is kind of, thinking within these narrow categories and not being willing to think. However, it is argued that such autonomy is largely a fiction. That's true. There is no real autonomy, which obscures the fact that economic production, as well as the smooth functioning of markets, ultimately and necessarily depends on the care labor primarily performed by women within the household, as well as the exploitation of nature and the presence of stable political institutions. So I want you to get this, right? This is just an introduction to the chapter on capitalism. We're introduced to the idea that markets cannot function, and it's meaningless to think of markets as functioning without the labor performed by women within the household. Yeah, okay, and as well as the exploitation of nature. Okay, nature definitely gets exploited under capitalism. Capitalism is the system of exploiting nature. Right? One of the things capitalism does. And the presence of stable political institutions. What kind of political institution? You'd think something about the political institutions that foster private property? No. But she goes on, but if capitalism can be found at work everywhere, this raises the question of how to delimit the phenomena. God, you want to rip your hair out. What are you talking about? Beyond disagreement about whether capitalism is an economic system or an institutionalized social order, there's also disagreement about how, through which method, and with the help of which disciplines, to answer the question of what capitalism is in the first place. She's writing the section on capitalism she doesn't know. While some believe that answering this question should be the purview of economic theory and conceptual analysis, others emphasize how capitalism as an historically specific phenomena, the constitution and development of which can only be identified through the study of history, whose complexity may confound analytic precision. Given these disagreements, it is not surprising that no unitary conversation about capitalism exists among disciplines. That's true. But isn't that part of what you're trying to do? This is the job of philosophers, to bring about a conceptual understanding that makes it possible for us to talk about these things across disciplines. And wouldn't, as a philosopher, you have to integrate ideas from economics and from history and from philosophy to gain an understanding of what the phenomenon of capitalism actually is, and maybe move towards some kind of definition. She continues, surely an entry such as this one might cover an extraordinary variety of themes and thinkers, but coverage must be selective and disputable, leaving aside matters that others might plausibly argue are no less essential than what is chosen for discussion here. Since this is an entry primarily addressed to people who have philosophical and normative interests in capitalism, we will exclusively focus on those accounts of capitalism that have most influenced contemporary philosophical work on the subject. So that gives it all away, right? So if you're only focused on the things that are most influenced contemporary philosophical work on the subject, and the reality is, and what this entry really brings forward is this reality. The reality is that, contemporary philosophical works on the subject are all, or almost all, exclusively negative, confrontational, critical of capitalism, and that's why this whole thing is exactly that. She says, the kind of questions we need to ask, all legit questions. What normative reasons and values, if any, support a capitalist organization of the economy and of society? By contrast, what reasons and values support the case for overcoming capitalism in order to try to bring about alternative modes of economic and social organization? Note she'll talk more, they'll talk more about the second than the first. Is there anything wrong or amiss with the way capitalism organizes economics and social life? That's almost the entire entry is just about that. If so, are these wrongs or ills distinctive of capitalism? Are they contingent to it or necessary, such as they cannot be overcome by leaving capitalism behind? Is capitalism unjust? Is it illegitimate? If capitalism is unjust, which I think is her implicit assumption is absolutely. And by the way, her implicit assumption is that capitalism is unjust because it leads to inequality. And that is all the way through this entry. Inequality is the enemy. If capitalism is unjust, could it be tamed or regulated in ways that would make it just while still remaining capitalism? Yeah. She says we will leave aside questions concerning socialist alternatives to capitalism and the process of social transition to them, as they have received extensive treatment in the entry on socialism. Notice there's no thinking here of maybe we're not in a capitalist world. We don't live under capitalism. And maybe what we should be discussing is ways to transition towards greater capitalism, more consistent capitalism. No, that would not even, that would not be considered. Okay, so we'll quickly. So that's kind of the intro, and then she says theories of capitalism. Section 1 is theories of capitalism. So this is, I assume, theories about what capitalism is and how it runs, how it functions, how it works, what's at the essence, what's at the heart of it. Theories of capitalism. So what would you expect to be the first thing you would present as a theory of capitalism? Well, you might consider maybe talking about Adam Smith, or even Hume, who wrote about markets, and say, while they don't use the term capitalism, clearly it's understood that at least Adam Smith is describing something akin to a capitalist system. And that is true of kind of Hume's discussion of trade and his economics writings. You could even go back and again talk about Locke under the idea that ultimately, capitalism rests on this idea of private property. Everything, all the descriptives involve private property, and it is Locke who really has the deeper philosophical discussion of property, private property, and what it is. So if you're thinking about doing it historically, you think you'd go back to that, but no. There's only one place this discussion of capitalism can actually begin, and that is with Karl Marx. That is with Karl Marx. Now, this again somewhat makes sense. It makes sense because I think that, and I don't know enough about contemporary philosophy to say it, but I think more broadly in the social sciences, in the humanities, and in other fields outside of economics, put it that way, outside of economics, the only prism through which people look at capitalism is a Marxist prism. It's in everything. Now, some of it is kind of in a post-Marxist, postmodern prism, but even postmodernism, takes, when it comes to capitalism, takes a Marxist perspective and it says, okay, but Marx was wrong on all these other things, and we're going to do something different. But they all start with Marx. It seems like almost all discussions out there in the world about capitalism in academia, outside of economics, start with Marx. Marx is the benchmark. And what does Marx say? What is the essence of capitalism? It's not, according to her, and I'm not going to critique her understanding of Marx, but just discuss what she presents Marx as saying. Capitalism is relentless accumulation. And here's how she starts. As far as theorizing capitalism is concerned, above anyone else, not even historically, just above anyone else, is Karl Marx, who, while he very rarely employed the term capitalism, titled his multi-volume opus, Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. She goes on, for Marx, notice, above all else, for Marx, the relentless accumulation of capital is the driving dynamic of capitalism. The relentless accumulation of capital is the driving dynamic of capitalism. Now, Marx believes that. But is there going to be any critique of this view? Is this true? Has history shown him to be right on this? What about growing standard of living, which is something Marx understood, and increasing wages among the working class, which is, again, Marx understood? But no, it's the relentless accumulation of industrial capital, or the means of production. Now, she says, look, Marx is very complex. We're not going to get into theory of capitalism. Is very complex. We're not going to get into everything. But it's accumulation of capital and it's exploitation. She writes, the widespread prominence of wage labor and the absence of alternatives to it is a necessary condition for the existence of capitalism. Again, God, this is so upside down. I mean, wage labor is a way in which people organize themselves when they are free from feudal shackles. And of course, they are free to organize themselves in other ways. They can, for example, form, communes. They can form co-ops. They can form other means by which to associate and to produce. They can become partners. They can form partnerships. But again, the wage labor is a necessary condition for the existence of capitalism. Maybe capitalism makes possible, i.e. the freedom, a free political order makes possible wage labor, which is a good because we consider it a good because it's voluntary. But here's Here's how she presents Marx. Wage laborers must be divorced from the means of production for capitalism to exist. This divorce happens when one class, the capitalist, own the means of production as their private property, and the other class, the proletarian, own nothing else but their labor power. Well, I mean, there's a lot that can be said here. We're not going to do a whole thing on Marx, right? But I mean, the reality is that why is that a divorce? The labor owns their own labor power, and they get compensated for that labor power. The capitalist, see, here's the thing. It goes back to that entrepreneur. You remember I talked about early that what they always miss, what's always excluded is the entrepreneur, the businessman, which Einstein celebrates, the businessman, is completely missing. Because the reality is that they don't understand what a businessman does. This is why he's an exploiter. So the businessman doesn't do anything except own the means of production. Everything that actually gets done, and only an academic can believe this, and this is why you don't have many Marxists who are not intellectuals. But the businessman does nothing but own the means of production, and therefore he's separated from the labor. But if the businessman, as businessmen are, actually works, actually does stuff, he's not just a paper shuffler, but he's actually producing, actively engaged in productive activity. He's, in a sense, a laborer. He's a worker. He also owns the means of production. And God forbid if you also give the workers some shares, like in their pension plan or 401k, and they are now, quote, capitalists, and they own some of the means of production. She can't even, Marx can't, and she can't comprehend such combinations. So the workers are forced by the inability to independently access the means of subsistence to work for the capitalists. So here's the thing. They can't work to earn a living. They can't earn a living. They can't feed themselves other than by working for the capitalists. And in that sense, right, that is, since they lack their own means of production, they are coerced to sell the only commodity they own, their labor power, in order to survive. So labor is coercive. It's forced. Because what's the labor going to do? Starve? That's not a choice. He can't go back to subsistence farming, they would argue, because how would he buy the farm? So the only way he can survive is by getting a job, which means that's coerced, that's forced. And of course, who's forcing him that? The capitalist. Now, you could argue that it's forced in quotation marks, by nature, by reality, by the fact that you have to produce the stuff that you're going to consume. And if you're going to eat, you have to produce that stuff that you're going to eat. And that is so work is necessary. And then the question is, what type of work are you engaged in? The farmers could have stayed on their land and be subsistence farmers. They chose to leave because wage labor actually turned out to be more valuable than subsistence farming, more valuable to their lives, more valuable by the standard of their life. Now, I don't want to go into the whole thing of Marx. I want to show you something, though. So all of this, there's a next paragraph starts, in addition to commodification of labor power. For Marx, a related precondition for the existence of capitalism is the widespread prominence of market exchange and the generalization of the commodity form. Workers produce neither for their own direct consumption nor for immediate consumption by the employer. Rather, they produce commodities for the sale in the marketplace. Okay, obvious. And he goes on, the dual prominence. Notice how long this is, by the way. The dual prominence of wage labor and market exchange, Marx assumes the existence of perfect market competition when modeling the exchange of all commodities. For Marx, labor is necessarily exploited by owners of capital. Marx is widely thought to use the term exploitation in a technical, non-moralized sense as extraction of surplus value from labor. However, Marx's understanding of exploitation has been used to ground many normative critiques of capitalism as unjust because exploitative system. But what is exploitation for Marx? Marx is more about, she says, according to Marx's labor theory of value, the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor required for its production. And she goes on, capitalists may extract absolute surplus value. And then she goes on, because of market competition, to say in business, capitalists have no choice other than to pay their workers the minimum wage the labor market will allow. They also have no choice because of market competition. So there are really no choices in capitalism. Everything is imposed by nobody, by a market phenomena, which is anonymous. This is really her big thing, is this anonymizing force that is placed on all of us. The unending need to extract relative surplus value is the engine of capital accumulation, as well as capitalism's drive to incessantly revolutionize all methods of production. Incessantly revolutionize. That's called innovation, but it just happens. It just happens. It doesn't require any particular thing for people to do. Thus, for Marx, capitalism is an economic system premised upon relentless and systematic accumulation of capital. The use of innovative, disruptive technologies of production, just happens, and last but not least, labor exploitation. And then she says, in the vast Marxist literature, various commentators and philosophers have emphasized different dimensions of Marx's analysis of capitalism. Some emphasize classes, some emphasize this other stuff. And then others have explored Marx's emphasis on various crisis tendencies. Marx has inspired theorists of racial capitalism. We'll get to that. Marx focuses on unequal exchange, and the capitalism has led writers on imperialism. All this stuff. And what is missing from all of this? She doesn't mention one person who is actually critical of Marx. She mentions Marx, she writes up Marx. No question about labor theory of value is true. Like, labor theory of value has been recognized by economists as untrue since at least the 1870s. 1870s, 155, 6 years ago. Does she mention that when she's writing about Marx? Does she critique it? No. Are there writers out there who think that there is no such thing as exploitation in the wage relationship? Yeah, there are writers like that. Does she mention any of them? No. Now, again, maybe they're not in the philosophy literature. Does there anybody out there who challenges the idea that profit is surplus value and that profit is unearned? Maybe profit is a reward on risk. Maybe profit is a reward for time. Maybe profit is a reward for the labor of the entrepreneur, the manager, the capitalist. No. Is there any challenge to these? None. Zero. Nada. Marx has just presented as is and then said, oh, there are all kinds of people who do all kinds of things with this Marxist stuff. But to challenge any of the Marxist assumptions, zero, nada, nothing. So the whole article becomes then just about capitalism qua Marx. On everybody else, so on almost everybody else, all the positive percentages of capitalism, she mentions all the critics, all the people who will criticize. So you saw how long Marx's section is. Here's Weber. Weber is the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Why this is so highly regarded, I have no idea. But I guess this is the idea that capitalism is more than just economics. That capitalism is culture and society. But even Weber doesn't believe that modern capitalism is fated to last forever. And and he's not particularly a fan of capitalism. But she says, regardless of all cultural accounts of capitalism, whether they focus on Protestantism or other cultural milieu, follow in Weber's footsteps and regard cultural and ideological phenomena rather than only or primarily material ones as crucial to understanding the birth development of the essence of capitalism. So the alternative here is Marx, the materialist, all about economics, and Weber, who understands that ideas and maybe religion impact this kind of stuff. And that's the alternative. And then of all the economists out there, social thinkers, economists, she chooses Schumpeter because Schumpeter actually brings in the entrepreneur. And, but, she mentions entrepreneurs are largely responsible for capitalism's irrepressible gales of creative destruction. And then again, she says, she uses the people themselves to undermine. She says, eventually, Schumpeter speculated, capitalist societies devalue entrepreneurship, paving the way for a post-capitalist bureaucratic socialism. I don't think Schumpeter saw that as a positive development, but she doesn't tell us she didn't view it that way. Schumpeter held that bouts of creative destruction create both winners and losers, a general social fatigue with relentless change and sufficient material abundance and comfort for intellectuals, including professors, to criticize capitalism's shortcoming. You would think that she would take that to heart, that Schumpeter saw it coming. But again, there's no definition of capitalism. There's no real explanation of what capitalism is. And look how much space she gives Schumpeter. And compare that to what she gave to Marx, several pages worth. Weber a little bit, Schumpeter even less. Hayek and Friedman, almost nothing. Almost nothing. Other important approaches to capitalism descend from other intellectual traditions than Marx. Oh, yeah, really? The most prominent non-Marxist approach claims descent, rightly or not, because the left likes to think Adam Smith is one of them, which is interesting. But anyway, from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. According to this account, the two necessary conditions for capitalism are the free market and private property. Arguably, Milton Friedman's and Friedrich Hayek distinctive variants of this approach have been the most influential. And then she just writes stuff that's just absolutely not true. She writes, from all these exchanges, she talks about the exchanges, an equilibrium, perhaps a general equilibrium, spontaneously arises in capitalist economy. That's absolutely not what Friedrich Hayek believes. She's using spontaneous order here. I assume she's talking about Hayek. And it's not what, certainly not what Hayek believes. Maybe Friedman. But she's using spontaneously. So she's talking about Hayek. Hayek doesn't believe you attain equilibrium. Certainly not general equilibrium. Hayek believes that you're constantly in motion. Indeed, this is one of the innovations of Austrian economics. You're constantly in motion. You never achieve the so-called equilibrium, the end. Because this constant, people's values are constantly changing, realigning. Hayek values is constantly shifting. Prices are constantly changing, weather constantly changing, everything is changing, and therefore everything changes. Hayek is all about information, prices, the dynamism of markets, not about equilibrium at all. So she isn't even getting it. And of course, such an economy that's be regarded as spontaneous order. They love the idea of spontaneous because she hates the idea of it being spontaneous. She says they argue that premised upon the spontaneous flow of free market exchange, capitalism is the most efficient economic system. Inherently, it has no real crisis tendencies that it cannot self-correct. Capitalism goes wrong when it is politically interfered with. See below. So she gives a little section to kind of the free market view of capitalism, the only view that really matters. an institutionalist account of capitalism. So this is the idea that capitalism derives from certain institutions like property rights. Here she cites Coase and North and Williamson and Ostrom, all good sources. But the idea, and she says, but again, look how little she's giving it. She's giving it a little space. Again, all that stuff on Marx, and then a little bit on the institutionalists who emphasize private property and the rule of law. And then she goes on to the new institutionalist, and here she cites Piketty, who is about as anti-capitalist as you can get. She says, but in the admittedly rough grouping, other prominent scholars in different, even contradictory ways have moved away from the market paradigm altogether, whether, for instance, to underscore the ideological prerequisites of capitalism, Piketty 2020. Here's the ideological prerequisites of capitalism are all wrong. Or relationship between capitalism and egalitarianism and inegalitarian institutions. So she gives short shrift to whoever's attempted over the last 150 years or 200 years to defend capitalism. She gives them almost nothing. And then she goes to Polanyi, who's an Austrian-Hungarian. He has an account of 19th century liberal capitalism in his book, The Great Transformation from 1944. But he's again hostile to capitalism. And look how long she gives him. She gives him much more than Hayek and Friedman, much more than to Coase and to North and Williamson. And by the way, where is McCluskey? She throws her out in a note here at some point. But so anyway, and then ultimately Keynes, investment-centered capitalism, whatever the hell that means. The existence of money as a store of value under capitalism means the capitalists can decide on the basis of their expectations about the uncertain future whether to invest in production or exercise their liquidity preference by either hoarding, there goes hoarding again, or speculating in liquid money-like assets. Okay, let me step back a second here before we go on, and she gives a little bit more room for Keynes. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is because all the popular people who do podcasts who criticize capitalism are all getting the bad stuff from people like her. Like 99.99999% of the people will never hear of her, never read any of her stuff, never read this entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia. But the professors read this, the intellectuals read this, and they pick up concepts like hoarding, and then they send it out there, or exploitation, or surplus value, the Marxist terminologies. And they will pick up on this general attitude towards capitalism, and then they will put their bells and whistles on it. This is how ideas spread in a culture. The intellectuals, the philosophers, write essays like this. Lots of other people, not lots, but dozens of other people read this and say, oh, this is capitalism, okay. And then they'll write their own pieces on it. And then the piece below that, the common podcaster will get the derivative of this. So we're going not to the source, because the source is kind of Marx, and the source is the people she's citing, but we're getting closer to the source of the ideas that the podcasters, who we'll go back to, next show we'll do, are going to popularize. And the mythologies that they are going to popularize. All right. Now she goes to a second section. So those were theories of capitalism. Now she's talking about normative defenses of capitalism. So in other words, why is capitalism good? So justifications for capitalism. And she has a number of these. So, the first one is welfarist arguments. So this is kind of a more utilitarian argument. Human beings are better off under capitalism. And notice how much she gives this. A short paragraph. Capitalism has been defended on consequentialist grounds as an economic system that best promotes overall social welfare compared to alternative systems. In contemporary debates, such as arguments often appeal to Adam Smith's influential defense of markets and of commercial society, right? And he goes on, assuming this is true, we here leave aside the empirical debate. We're not gonna think about whether capitalism has done any good materially. We're not gonna debate that. This is an entry on capitalism. Isn't that important? She says, then a Smith-inspired defense of capitalism is supported by a utilitarian notion of welfare maximization. That's right. Coupled with a sufficientarian ideal of a society where no matter how much inequality exists, all enjoy a decent standard of living. Notice inequality is snuck in here. Why is inequality important? What gives inequality validity? Why does inequality have any weight in a discussion about normative stuff? No argument is made for that. It's just accepted because that's what's out there in the culture, among intellectuals at least. The second is efficiency-based argument. Efficiency is at the center of defenses of capitalism. For example, Hayek, spontaneous order, a political regime of liberty is also necessary for the market to function efficiently. Such a regime of liberty is in turn instrumentally valuable because it allows for the pursuit of achievement of a variety of valuable human purposes, including the preservation of liberty itself, right? Planners, by contrast, she writes, can only achieve their goals, this is Hayek, can only achieve their goals by imposing their own conception of values on everyone else, thereby engendering tyranny. And then she does something which she hasn't done at scale yet. This is the first time she really brings it in. Critics may wonder, she says, what happens to Hayekian justification of capitalism if what people happen to want or prefer is a fully egalitarian redistribution of wealth or the common ownership of the means of production? Now, further, Hayek himself was aware of the fact that when an immoral market becomes the predominant means of social coordination, the alienation and greed that such mechanisms may engender could destabilize the proper operations of markets themselves. So everybody knows that markets create alienation and greed. Hayek himself admitted it. Hayek's response to these potential problems invokes the market's superior epistemological capabilities compared to conscious human action, as well as the role of markets in fostering community. Now, notice the contrast here. And again, I'm picking particularly words, but it's important. Notice the contrast here between market's superior epistemological capabilities compared to conscious human action. What is the market's superior epistemological capabilities? And this is the fault of Hayek. I'm not blaming her here. I'm blaming Hayek here. What is the market's superior epistemological capabilities? It's individual conscious human actions, or more precisely, individual conscious human thinking, individual conscious human reasoning, which plays out in the marketplace as these epistemological capabilities, the pricing mechanism, and the information that embodies. But that is only made possible through the activities, the epistemological activities, the reasoning activities of individual human beings. You don't get group think, a thought coming out of a group. What you get is individual thinking that is then coordinated by some mechanism, a market mechanism, or just negotiations into the statement of the group. Anyway, she goes into this, but here she's bringing in, a bunch of people who might disagree. And then there's freedom-based arguments. So she gave Hayek a little bit more room here. Freedom-based arguments. Capitalism is often defended on the grounds of freedom. And here she says, this is the idea of negative freedoms, thou shalt not. While negative liberty, the absence of coercion, restraints on action, has figured prominently in such defenses, Smith 76, Friedman, Hayek, Brennan. Argument for capitalism was also relied on alternative conceptions of freedom. And here she brings in people like Tomasi and all kinds of people who've compromised on the very nature of capitalism. And she talks about this. She talks about Republican freedom. But again, in every one of these, she then includes a section of the critics and why it doesn't really make any sense. Right? Again, critics dispute the characterization of market relationships as non-dominating, especially in the context of capitalist labor markets, pointing out that relations of domination and undue dependence characterize many, if not all, employment relations under capitalism. She's just, right? She didn't criticize Marx, but now she's criticizing all the people who come up with positives. They point out, following Marx, that those who have the appearance of free and systematically situated contracting parties are in fact workers who often have no reasonable alternatives but to put themselves under the arbitrary power of their employers. The arbitrary power of their employers. And then there's a section about positive freedoms, which is, the capacity to form, pursue, and revise, and self-authorship. And she brings in Rawls here. And, this is a pretty long section because this is a section, because Rawls is such a big deal. Tomasi, who was a professor at Brown, he's not anymore there, but he was a professor at Brown, political science professor, wrote a whole thing about how Rawls was consistent with free markets. It was one massive rationalization. It was like, I like Rawls, I like free markets, I'm going to somehow put them together. It doesn't go together. A bunch of libertarians try to do this. And she likes it because it's Rawls, and Rawls is an egalitarian. Rawls makes a big deal out of inequality. And then there's, what she calls normative, normative defenses. We talked about positive freedom. We talked about political freedom. Normative defenses of capitalism have also appealed to the value of political freedom. Friedman predominantly argues that economic freedom is an indispensable means towards the achievement of political freedom. And then she talks about entitlement-based arguments. Entitlement-based arguments, which is a weird way of framing it. But here she brings out Robert Nozick. She says, in contemporary philosophy, Robert Nozick's libertarianism is often taken to provide the most direct and unequivocal defense of capitalism. One based on the principle of self-ownership and on historical entitlement theory of justice in holdings. And I'm not going to go through the whole Nozick section, but she gives Nozick a little bit here about his views on capitalism. But again, she says, however, Nozick's libertarianism does not require capitalism. All that it demands is that people be left free to do as they please with their justly acquired property, and that they not be forced to give up what is rightly theirs. And she says, Nozick can't object to them then forming communes and living under socialism. He also can't object to slavery contracts. So then, she's talking about kind of Nozick. This is where she brings in Rand. She says, because philosophical libertarianism does not necessarily lead to capitalism. I think that's right. Characterizing popular defenders of capitalism, such as, for example, Ayn Rand as libertarian, risks generating confusion. Rand, 1964, she's referring to The Virtue of Selfishness, unlike Nozick, would judge voluntary socialist associations as morally impermissible because incompatible with ethical egoism, according to which one should, morally speaking, act according to one's rational self-interest. But Rand's egoism is completely extraneous to libertarianism as a theory of justice, not capitalism. So, I mean, she's really onto something here. But why then is there not a section on Rand? And she ignores in the bibliography, including in the bibliography, Rand's Capitalism, Not an Ideal. And the first essay is, what is capitalism? I mean, at least give it. I mean, you mentioned Rand, you mentioned egoism. Why not actually address Rand's defense of capitalism? Maybe because it's too complicated, because it relies on the existence of objective values. But at least lip service something. All right, then there's virtue-based arguments. These arguments that say that capitalism is good because it encourages ethical behavior. But then there's a whole literature that says it actually it discourages ethical behavior and encourages bad behavior. And then there's the normative critiques of capitalism. So that was the normative defenses of capitalism. So let's go through the normative critiques of capitalism quickly, and then we'll call it a day. Functionalist critiques. Functionalist critiques argue that capitalism is inherently prone to undermining its own functioning. Such arguments tend to appeal to Marx's argument about crisis tendencies of capitalism, whether the tendency of profit rate to fall, a tendency towards systematic anarchy that breeds financial crisis, or the need for a reserve army of unemployed to suppress wages and living standards. There is debate on whether pointing to these tendencies requires taking an independent normative standpoint. God. Why isn't there anything here about the fact that all of this is bullshit? That, that while that capitalism does not lead to crises, that while profits tend to fall until new innovations arise that cause profits to rise again, and that tendency of profits to fall as a consequence of competition, which drives quality and prices down for consumers and therefore has huge benefits to all of us. And that it is absolutely nonsense that it's a tendency towards systemic anarchy. What does that even mean? Define it. And breeds financial crisis. Government intervention is what breeds financial crisis. Or the need for a reserve army of unemployed. That is complete nonsense. Indeed, in the heyday of capitalism, the reserve army of unemployed were immigrants. But they weren't employed where they were. They just switched jobs. So none of the critics of functional critiques are presented here, whereas the defenses were all you were given criticisms of. None of this is given criticism of. Distributive critiques. Capitalism is being criticized on the grounds of distributive justice. Especially in his latest work, John Rawls argued that both laissez-faire and welfare state capitalism are incompatible with the principle that ought to govern arrangements of society's basic structure in order for society to be just. And she goes on, she gives Rawls's argument, Rawls's critique of the welfare state, why it's not enough. You need more of that. By the way, this is a lengthy passage on Rawls, which makes complete sense. Against Rawls was a philosopher. He wrote in their language, and he came to dominate. He came to dominate this world. Now, the criticisms of Rawls that she presented are mainly criticisms of Rawls not going far enough. Or criticisms of Rawls that what he's proposing is not an alternative to capitalism, it's just a tinkering of capitalism. What we really need is an alternative to capitalism. But there's no criticisms of Rawls that his whole theory is wrong and his whole approach is wrong from, let's say, pro-capitalist people. Exploitation. The most influential critique of capitalism is contained in Marx's account of exploitation, although, as we saw, Marx debatably did not provide such an account as a moral critique, but rather as a description of capitalism's objective functioning. But does anybody question whether capitalism is exploitative? Now, she has some stuff here. Defenders of capitalism would further object that appropriation of surplus value by capitalists does not necessarily amount to unequal exchange because the capitalist entrepreneur offers special inputs into production, including risk taking. Then why is she even using surplus value? And it's not surplus value. But she continues. See, here she presents a critique, but then she answers the critique. To this, it could be answered that workers are not better off in a capitalist economy because they must work in order to achieve the same level of consumption, longer hours than they would if the capital stock was collectively owned. But there's everywhere that the capital stock is collectively owned, production grinds to a halt. And they're not better off. So when she finds a criticism of Marx and exploitation, she answers the criticism. When she's criticizing the defenders of capitalism, there's no answer that they provide. I mean, her presentation is so non-objective. She says the question of the wrongfulness of exploitation would then seem to depend on the previous question of whether the background and unequal distribution of productive property can be justified. The question of the wrongfulness of exploitation, but the idea of exploitation is not being questioned. And then, she goes on according to a second account, the problem with capitalist exploitation is that it amounts to unfair advantage taking. And she goes on, and exploitation gets a long section again, because this is what a lot of people write about. And it goes on and on. Then domination. Critiques grounded in a concern for domination can be broadly divided into interactional and structural critiques. And I'm not going to read this. But the point is, look how much is given to the critiques of capitalism. Normative critiques of capitalism. Look how much was given to defense of capitalism. Not much. Normative critiques but critiques of capitalism, lots of them. So we got domination. After domination, there's political self-determination. Critiques of capitalism argue that capitalism undermines political values, including democratic legitimacy and political self-determination. This is something you hear all the time out there. Insofar as it allows for large inequalities of wealth and capital, that distorts politics, we're told. I just did a segment on the show yesterday that showed that money doesn't buy you votes. Indeed, people who spend a lot of money didn't win their election. There's no necessary relation between the two. And insofar as economic inequality can be converted through a variety of mechanisms into political inequality, capitalism is de facto incompatible with proper functioning of democratic process and with the basic democratic principles, and as a principle of fair opportunity for the political influence. This is the problem when you don't define capitalism. You don't define what you mean by democracy. Why is democracy a good? By the way, I'm doing a debate about democracy where I'm taking the position that democracy is not a good. So I'm taking the anti-democracy position at a debate in the Festival of Philosophy and Music in London in September. So if you're in London and you'd like to come, you can buy a one-day ticket. It's let the light in, something like that. It's called, but it's the conference of. It's a festival of philosophy and music. And it's in London, September, I can't remember. I think it's 2021, something like that. And I'm on the Sunday, and I'm doing two panels, one on freedom, one on freedom and one on democracy. What is freedom? So yes, a whole thing about how it's incompatible with democracy, and then a whole thing about alienation, again, unchallenged. Capitalism is also being criticized in the guise of individual and social alienation. Alienation is generally understood as a pathological a relation of separation or of psychological state of detachment between a subject and an object. Individuals are, for example, said to be alienated from their own life when they cannot identify with it, or when they feel indifferent to how life goes. Workers are said to be alienated from the product of their labor when they cannot understand or relate it to it as the product of their own actions, as their own, and rather perceive or relate to it as a separate alien product. This is straight out of Marx, 1844. Alienation is, the way Marx thinks of it. Capitalism can be regarded as being alienating in more than one way and in relation to more than one domain. And she has a whole theory of how, because individuals make investments, and those investments are guided by the market and profitability, even everybody is alienated from the product of those investments because they didn't make the investments. So she writes here, more recently, some, she cites herself, have argued that capitalism generates an alienated relation between citizens and their social political order, because by leaving transformative investment decisions to impersonal market forces, it deprives citizens of control over the future of their society. Now, this you can see right now. This is what's going on with artificial intelligence. This is what's going on with the data centers, right? Individuals, citizens, have not been consulted about the deployment of data centers. And therefore, she would argue, and I think this is what is being promulgated out there into the culture, that they are alienated as a consequence. There's a data center going up, but I don't want a data center. I had no say in this. And I should have a say in this. This is, it's going to affect my future. There's going to be AI. I don't know if I want AI. So this is the sense in which it's alienating. We're going to get the internet whether we want it or not. We're going to get AI whether we want it or not. Now, who's we? It's democracy, the majority. She writes, under such conditions, citizens cannot be reasonably expected to regard their society as the result of their collective doing and valuing, and cannot affirm it as their own. So capitalism is alienating because all this stuff, like the internet, came about. Nobody asked me about it. I didn't create the internet. I didn't participate in creating. I didn't vote to invest in it. Ooh. So it's not mine. So I feel alienated from it. I mean, do you find this really, really bizarre? A bizarre way of thinking about the world? I use it. I interact with it. I create pages on it. So I do make stuff on it. I am participating of it. And if I don't want to use it, I don't use it. But she continues, well, it may be that only workers are exploited under capitalism. All citizens, whether capitalists or not, are socially alienated, which is bizarre. Do you feel alienated? This leaves open the further question of whether capitalism, by necessarily alienating citizens from their social political world, generates a distinctive kind of unfreedom, different from domination, interference, and mere lack of autonomy. This is her writing. This is her theory. This is what she believes. So, of course, there's going to be no criticism. Further, insofar as an interest in non-alienation can be regarded as a grounding value of political self-determination, and the latter should be arguably exercised compatibly with its grounding values, to argue that capitalism is necessarily socially alienating may lend support to the view that capitalism is illegitimate, whether or not it is also unjust. I don't know exactly what that last sentence meant, and I'm not going to read it slowly to get it. You get the kind of language, though. We're all alienated from capitalism. because capitalism produces results that we had no say. The market produces results that we had no say in bringing about, which is, really, really striking and interesting. I think this is original for her, right? Investment decisions determine our future. How much money is invested in AI is going to determine the future of all of us. And yet we don't make decisions about investment. But the thing is, if you believe progress is beneficial, progress is good for human beings, then we are all the massive beneficiaries of other people's investment decisions. And other people's investment decisions are only going to be successful if we embrace that future. That is, if investors, because of market pressures, invest in a technology that turns out to be something we don't want, we just don't want, they will lose their money. So the market is self-correcting in a way as to make sure the investments that actually get made, the meaning that those investments are profitable is that they're embraced by consumers, they're embraced by participants in the marketplace, they're embraced by us. Now, maybe not a majority of us, but a significant number of us for them to be really profitable. That's a simple critique that I just came up with on the fly to that one. But there's no critique here. And the section of criticism of capitalism is not ended yet, because there's a feminist critique, which basically says that housework, the birthing and rearing of children, the care of adults, the elderly and the unemployed is done by women who don't get compensated for it. That without such unpaid labor, production would be impossible, and yet capital does not value such work. Indeed, it does not accord it even a subsistence salary. But it does. I mean, not in a sense that, whoever, because that work is not economically productive. And to the extent that it's economically productive, and to the extent that, in a household, a woman does certain things, then she also shares in the income of her husband, or the other way around. So in this way, capitalism exploits women, contributes to the reproduction of gender inequality and patriarchal domination within the household. Women today, in many respects, out-earn men, and reproduces a mystified idea of the family as a private sphere rather than an integral part of the economy. But family is a private sphere. Family is not a part of the economy. Family is not the economy. Not everything is the economy. Again, no criticism of this. Just more elaboration. Feminists have also expanded their critique of capitalism by denouncing capitalism's tendency towards feminization of labor, whatever the hell that means, as well as radicalization of care work. Racialization of care work. By feminization is meant the increased expansion of forms of employment and service jobs that, because of their precarious, low wage and care-related character, share many of the exploitative features of forms of domestic labor traditionally performed by women. And then there's racial capitalism. Recently, there's been growing attention to the interrelation between capitalism and white supremacy, and to what has become known as racial capitalism. In its stronger version, racial capitalism indicates a non-contingent, necessary, and inherent relationship between capitalism and white supremacy. I mean, this is so ahistorical. It drives me nuts. Have not the most capitalist places on earth been the ones that have eliminated slavery first? England, the United States. Have they not been the ones that ultimately fought against racial discrimination? Was the North not a better place than the South? the North being capitalist, the South being more feudal. She writes, capital can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. The very existence of inequality suggests racism. And again, and then capitalism and nature, the exploitation of the environment, the destruction of the environment. And then she talks about further topics, and most of these further topics are, again, topics that relate to criticisms of capitalism. She says, there she has provided an overview, this is the ending, right, of many complexities involved in theorization of capitalism, privileging these accounts of capitalism that have directly influenced contemporary debates in political theory and philosophy. It has shown how a plurality of values and principles grounded the normative cases for and against capitalism. Yeah, but mostly against. The entry has also clarified how many defenses and critiques of capitalism are ultimately only defenses and critiques of some of its aspects, and that what counts as a distinctive normative critique of capitalism remains unsettled. Overall, the entry demonstrates that there's a growing interest in capitalism as an object of normative analysis and critique. I wish. All right. So let's summarize. I've already gone an hour and 40 minutes, which is long for this stuff. All right. How do I switch out of this? And I'm not going to show you any of her video because it's not worth it. It's be repetitive. Notice that for our intellectual class, and as we'll see when we discuss Patrick Deneen with Nikos on Sunday, as I discuss Patrick Deneen with Nikos on Sunday, this is true of the right, certainly elements of the right, as well as the left. Underlying all discussions of capitalism is Marx. They might not all be Marxists in the sense of agreeing with Marx's entire system of Marxist philosophy. Very few people are Marxist in that sense. But they all take Marxist ideas for granted. The idea of exploitation is taken for granted. The idea of excess value that is the fact that the capitalist gets excess value from the employee is taken for granted. The idea that capital just accumulates, the idea of alienation, which is again goes back to Marx. The idea of alienation, which is huge, it's all over this woman's work, is taken direct from Marx. The idea that there's something wrong with inequality is taken from others other than Marx. But the premise of almost all the discussion of capitalism out there today among left and right are anti-capitalist ideas. That's the starting point. That's where they're coming from. That's the fundamental assumptions and the basis. And to some of us, when we hear them talk about this stuff, it's like, what are they talking about? And unless you realize that the whole field, the whole way in which people approach the topic of capitalism is shaped by Marxism, and therefore, and today by intersectionality and identity politics, and this is the feminization and the racialization and all of this stuff by post-colonial, which is just exploitation taken to another dimension. This is what frames the entire discussion. You wonder why it's so difficult to make progress out there against these people. It's because there's a sense in which we're not in the same reality. We're not talking about the same stuff. We certainly don't have the same kind of foundation. We don't know the same history. And we don't understand our relationship in the marketplace in the same way. I mean, this idea of alienation is just, I don't know what they're talking about. Now, there is a sense in which there's alienation, There's an excellent article, I think maybe his best article by Nathaniel Brandon in Capitalism, Not an Unknown Ideal, about alienation, but it's a very different concept. When people are told they're being exploited, when people are told they're out of control, when people are told they don't reap the benefits of progress, when people are told that they're just being exploited and used by the rich, and that AI is just going to take their jobs, it's not going to give them anything, there's no benefit to them, there's just downside, then yeah, they are going to feel alienated. The alienation doesn't come from anything in reality. The alienation comes from the fact that the intellectuals' job it is to explain what's going on in reality to common folk, explain it in ways that alienate common folk from what is actually going on. But it's the explanation that's alienating, not the phenomena itself. Not the phenomena itself. It's it's super frustrating because, again, on any one of these, you need to write an essay. Any one of these, you need to write a book. And Ayn Rand wrote a lot of that. Wrote a lot of books. Wrote Capitalism, Not an Unknown Ideal, which is not cited here. On the whole thing on capitalism, Ayn Rand is not, that book of Ayn Rand is just not there. At least Virtue of Selfishness is like a throwaway to Ayn Rand. But why not capitalism? And why just one little tiny paragraph? Nozick gets a whole section. Why? Because Nozick was a former philosopher in a philosophy department, and he deserves attention. Rand was not. She was an outsider. Hayek is respected. Milton Friedman is respected. So but even they get a little bit. Marx, huge amount. And the critics, massive quantities. But again, that's because in the world of philosophy, there are very few defenders. Very few defenders. Most of the defenders are in the world of economics, and therefore not taken that seriously by philosophers. So as we go through critiquing the critics, we will see a lot of these issues keep coming back. A lot of myths about how capitalism functions, about how it works, what it does, and human relations, and how people relate to one another under capitalism. And of course, note, and this is really important, there's a whole entry here on capitalism, an entire entry, and not a single attempt to define what it is she's talking about. So there's a mishmash here of capitalism, some capitalist elements, mixed economy, statism. There's no clarity on what exactly are we talking about. What is this thing that Marx, I mean, Marx had more clarity over capitalism than she does. And even when she talks about capitalism, about Marx's view of capitalism, she does not present a lot of the material about how capitalism arose, about the fact that it benefited the worker, about the fact that rising standard of living. None of that makes it into her description of Marx's. It's just about exploitation, alienation. That's what these people are interested in. So, and if you watch her videos, she is an out and out socialist. She wants everything to be voted on within the corporation. So within the business should be owned by its workers. Everything should be voted on. 21st Century Motor from Atlas Shrugged is exactly that. She wants that. That's to solve the alienation of the workers in the wage relationship with the employers. But then ultimately, the most important part of solving the alienation of all of us from in the system is to socialize, democratize all investment decisions, and to have everything centrally planned, and for us to have a political incentive to vote, because everything comes from the top down. And you have experts who make investment decisions or recommend investments to all of us who vote. But here again is the dismissal of the individual human mind. The idea that anybody can invest, that anybody can make decisions about the future, that anybody knows what's good and bad. Versus, and so we can all vote on stuff we know nothing about. Let's vote on AI. I don't know what AI is. I don't know how it works, but let's vote on it. And then, the disregard for the fact that in a private market, in capitalism, if you invest and you're mistaken, you suffer the cost for that. And not a lot of people get hurt, in a sense, right? But if central planners make a mistake, the damages are huge. Everybody suffers. And the fact, when I'm investing other people's money, and I'm, through voting, my attitude is going to be very different than I'm investing my money or other people's money that have given me a fiduciary responsibility to invest it for them. The whole way in which they approach this is, again, Marxist in a sense. It's deterministic. If we just got rid of the capitalists, we got rid of investment, if we democratized everything, progress would still happen. Good decisions would still be made. They'd just be made differently. They'd be made democratically, and we'd all own them. How? It's like innovation would still happen. How? If the innovators are not allowed to innovate, if the innovators must get a vote in order to innovate, must get other people to vote for their innovation. How does that work? The idea of people specialize in investment, people specialize in entrepreneurship, people specialize in innovation, that is beyond their capacity to understand. All of that would just happen spontaneously. I once read a book by these leading environmentalists, and they were saying, look, we need all this technology that can produce, let's say, clean energy. And it's like, how will we get it? It'll just happen. It'll just arise. And we'll centralize everything. Everything will be under government control, and the technology will just show up. It's this unbelievable determinism. All right. I hope you found value in that. I know that was not necessarily easy. We'll keep refining the format of these. And as I said, next time we'll do a popular podcast, who's critical of capitalism. And we'll do that. I've already got which one lined up. It's got like 2.6 million views already on it. So you can see it, but it's just horrible. I'll just end with this. It's just horrible that Stanford would choose Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is a serious place, a serious encyclopedia, serious effort goes into these essays, that they would choose somebody who is so biased, somebody who has an agenda, and to choose to publish an essay that's so skewed in one direction. It's, I think, really horrible. And, just look at the citations, as I said, and compare it to the entry on socialism, where they got somebody who's pro-socialism. They could have found some philosopher who's pro-capitalism to write up the entry on capitalism. But no, they chose a critic of it. I mean, it would have been interesting. They could have got Greg Salmieri to write it, there are lots of philosophers out there. The libertarian philosophers. There are plenty of philosophers out there. Not a lot, but there's some who are pro-capitalist and could have done a decent job presenting the pros and cons and presenting a real thing on capitalism. But that's not what they chose. They chose an entry not on capitalism, but on the critique of capitalism and a Marxist view of capitalism as the theme and the essence of it. All right. Thanks, guys. I hope, as I said, I hope you enjoyed that. Let's see. We have a lot of Super Chat questions, and you guys have been pretty generous on the Super Chat. I appreciate that. Thank you. Let's do this. Let's start by thanking the stickers. Let's see. Selfish subscriber, $50. Thank you. Enric, thank you. Bonnie, thank you. Barry, thank you. And Alan, thank you for quite a few stickers. This is good. And Roland, thank you. Yeah, thank you guys. Really, really appreciate it. And let's see, we're going into our third hour now, so that's great. Okay, Prime Mover has asked a like a multi-part question. So even though his question doesn't have any one of the parts of it doesn't have the most dollars associated with it, accumulative it does, right? Because this is like a part 5, part 6, part 7. Part 7, so that's 7 times 20, it's $140 question. So thank you, Prime Mover. So let's read this lengthy question and I'll try to answer it. So this is Prime Mover. Part 1. Well, I won't read the parts. I haven't heard you address this angle on AI. I would like to hear your thoughts. I understand your admiration for the technological achievement of LLMs. However, isn't there some reason to be concerned? Given the technology's capability for integrating large swaths of info, isn't there reason to think that the massive data center expansion is creating the infrastructure for massive expansion of the surveillance state? In the context of Snowden, he showed that companies like Verizon, AT&T, etc., were secretly feeding information to the NSA. What is stopping companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, Facebook that want to be regulated from utilizing their models and massive data capabilities to, for example, create secret social scores or profiling for political dissidents, or go after people who have hurt Trump's feelings? So let me just catch up here. Further, what happens when the AI data center boom cycle goes bust and all the excess capacity is just sitting around with nothing to do? Who is the buyer of last resort? Is it not the NSA? Snowden showed there's no such thing as privacy online. It is a matter of everything you say or do being cataloged. The day that you oppose the wrong administration, all the information needed to bury you is a click away. I see no company today besides perhaps Apple that is going to stand on principle against such an overreach. With authoritarianism on the rise, do you think that pushing back against data centers is completely unreasonable? Yes, but I understand your point, and it's a point well taken, but I still think it's wrong. I mean, if we really took your argument seriously, we would say, look, we should have never supported the invention of the microprocessor. We should have shut it down right then and there. Because, of course, none of this is possible without the microprocessor. And, of course, the internet, as you said, nothing you said on the internet is private. Now, you have the option not to go on the internet. But the reality is when you go on the internet, nothing is private. And the NSA could, if they wanted to, access it and score you whether you had data centers or not. All the data centers do is they make it more efficient. They make it more efficient. So, yes, all advancements in technology from the beginning of time, in a sense, have led us to where we are today. And all of them can be used in nefarious ways. And that's always been true. I mean, do you know that I just read this today. When Steve Jobs left Apple, he started a company called Next. It turns out Next's biggest customers was CIA. CIA bought Next computers, and in a sense kept Next alive until Jobs moved to Apple, bought Next, used the operating system on Apple. I mean, every innovation that we use is going to be used by the government. The military today is incorporating AI in all its weapon systems. Those weapon systems can be turned on us easily. But again, let's step back. The automobile led to the invention of a tank. The rifle led to the invention of, a repeating rifle and automatic weapons today, which the military has in huge quantities that can be turned on us. Nuclear weapons can be turned on us. So my point is absolutely. AI data centers, massive quantities of computing can be turned on us. They can be turned against us, the citizens. They can be turned to spy on us, to control us, to give us social scores. Indeed, to some extent or another, that is already happening in China. What do you do about it? Do you consciously promote the stopping of growth, of technological growth? Do you actively suppress progress? And maybe you advocate for going backwards. I mean, this is where Michael Knowles is right. In 1220, you could go out to the mountains and live your life and probably not be harassed by anybody. You could be a subsistence farmer somewhere and not be harassed. You could avoid people. Maybe even 150 years ago, you could probably find a spot in the mountains where nobody would ever find you. It is true that as technology has progressed, we have satellites that give you satellite images. They can find a dime. They can find, anybody, anywhere. Do we stop technological advance because we're afraid of government? And my answer is no. What it means is we have to work in two different domains. We have to, pursue the improvement in our own lives, progress, economic progress, technological progress. I mean, think of life today without the internet. Think of life today without an iPhone. But the internet and the iPhone make surveillance of you much more likely and much more possible than the flip phones of the past, or even, maybe the landlines were even more accessible to surveillance, but it's all accessible to surveillance. But now we have our whole lives on these phones, break into those phones, and there's technology that allows them to break into the phones. They've got everything. But do we want to live without them? I say no. So we have to fight on two fronts. The first is to fight for continued progress. And the second is to fight political encroachment, to fight the NSA listening to our devices, to fight the Patriot Act, to fight Trump, to fight authoritarianism. Will we lose? Probably. But I'd rather live in a world of progress, of innovation, of better products, of AI and everything that it can make possible, and ultimately lose, we all die at some point, then consciously accept the idea of, I'm going to retard progress. I'm going to not use the best technology. I'm going to stop entrepreneurs from developing it. I'm going to stop entrepreneurs from moving forward. Am I going to still end up with authoritarianism? Absolutely. Even more so. Because the very act of stopping entrepreneurs is an authoritarian act. You're basically saying, yes, the government has the authority to stop them. Yes, we by vote should be able to stop them, should be able to control them. And that is sanctioning authoritarianism. In my view, stopping the building of data centers will speed up authoritarianism, will speed up centralized control of what we do. And they'll use whatever tools are available to them. Yes, they won't be the best tools. There'll still be tools. The Nazis did a pretty good job of controlling all of us without AI. Yes, AI makes it more efficient. I get that. But AI also makes fighting them more efficient. It makes my growth more efficient. It makes the level of the knowledge that I have greater. It makes the tools of the fight greater. I argued this about the internet. Yes, the internet makes the control over me more possible, but the internet also makes it possible for me to get my ideas out there to a big audience. Now, there's no guarantee I will win and they lose. It's likely they win and I lose, but I have to fight. And in that fight, I want the best tools available. I want AI. And do I know that by wanting AI, the government also gets AI? Absolutely. And look, here's the other thing. So one, opposing data centers will actually lead to more authoritarianism, not less. Second, if we stop OpenAI and Anthropic and Meta from building AI, who do you think will pick up the slack? Well, one, we're not going to stop the Chinese, so they're going to pick up the slack, maybe to the point where they'll establish authoritarianism and get such a lead that they will take America one day and we'll all become slaves of a Chinese state. Maybe that's far reaching. But in response to Chinese advancing, what do you think the American government will do? They will invest in AI. They will build AI. Now, maybe it won't be quite as efficient as OpenAI and Anthropic. All these data centers will be nationalized. And new ones will be built, but they'll be built by the government with taxpayer money. That's not a problem. So I see so many downsides to the idea of infringing on liberty. So my view is you just don't infringe on liberty. You never advocate for a policy of infringing on liberty, infringing on freedom, because that plays into the hands of the authoritarians. The bad guys, they are going to use whatever technology is available. They're going to try everything in the book. They're going to try to take over the world. They're going to try to enslave you one way or the other. The only way to resist them is not by slowing down freedom. It's not by slowing down progress. It's not by slowing down entrepreneurs. It's by liberating them and fighting the authoritarians, explicitly acknowledging and fighting them. Not easy. I acknowledge that it's not easy. I guess I don't see an alternative, though. So, yeah, Tommy wants to be enslaved by Russia. You could do that. You can get on a plane and go to Russia. You don't have to wait. God, I don't get these people. Just go. They'll welcome you with open hands. You can say, I want to go to the Uyghurs camps out west. They'll take you. They'll drive you there. They'll give you a ride. I wonder if Tommy's ever been to China. I'm curious. People often are most adamant about things they know nothing about. So, no, I mean, I get the fear. I understand the fear. I think it's real. And we should be monitoring it. But I don't think AI is going to make the difference. If we're moving towards authoritarianism, they're going to get us anyway. I put out my stuff on YouTube. They don't need AI to find me. And I'm not going to stop because I'm worried. I'm not going to stop making fun of Trump or attacking Trump. I'm going to continue fighting. And so most of us are going to be found out even with the tools they have today. So they get better tools. Yeah, but we also get better tools. I couldn't have anywhere near the reach that I have today, without the internet. And I can only imagine what my reach is going to be once I figure out how to use AI and once AI is fully developed. So I view it as a tool to challenge the authoritarians, but they might win. It's likely that they win. They've got a head start on us. Fine. No matter what tools they have, them winning is catastrophic. All right. Okay, $50. Michael. Objectivism is growing slowly because altruism is such a core belief system to so many people. They get hysterical when you attack it. It's like you're trying to take away something that provides them with their identity. Yes, their moral identity, their whole view of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. Right? What is good and what is bad. And it goes to the core of who we are. Almost all of us want to be good. And of course, it's something that's drilled into us from a very young age. It's associated with our parents, it's associated with our teachers, with our preachers, with our religion, with our deepest, most cherished beliefs. So it's very hard to give up on. And it's something that, we get very upset when it's attacked. So you can understand, because it deals with the most fundamental question of right and wrong, good and evil. What to do with your life? What's the right path? And the older people get, the more committed they get to the ideas that they grew up with, the more difficult it is to dislodge it. Wes, a $50 sticker. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Of course, as I suggested, Tommy has never been to China. He should go. He should go. It's an amazing place. I recommend everybody go to China and check it out because it is an amazing place. I love China. I've enjoyed all my trips there, even though the last one they were kind of looking for me. But I enjoyed all my trips there. I won't go back, not anytime soon, not while Xi is running things. But it's truly an amazing place. You'll learn a lot by going to China. But I do find it interesting that people are very passionate and very engaged and have strong opinions about things they know nothing about. Michael, it seems to really stop, another $50. Thank you, Michael. It seems to really stop technological progress. You need communism. You need totalitarian oppression and abolition of private property. Short of that, economies grow, even at a snail's pace. I mean, maybe, there's a bunch of economies out there in the world who don't have communism, who haven't completely abolished private property. They grow because America grows. I really believe if you look at the economies of the world, a large number of them are free riding, in a sense, off the United States, off the fact that we still innovate. How many countries around the world have an internet because it was invented and created in the United States and it wouldn't exist and they wouldn't be able to use it without us? And the economic growth that comes from using the internet is there. How many of them have better healthcare because of innovations that happen in the United States? So if the United States erodes, doesn't turn all communist, but significantly erodes its private property, maybe it could grow a little bit. But I fear that a lot of the other countries would ground to a halt and maybe descend. So, I don't buy this. A little bit of private property is enough. I think you need a lot more than that. And it depends on, of course, the context. Stephen Harper, thank you for the sticker. Nature Observer, thank you for the sticker. Really appreciate it, guys. Michael, do Luddites always lose? These medieval anti-data center policies won't ultimately stop the AI revolution. Even the anti-capitalist nihilists in California wouldn't stop Waymo and the self-driving car revolution. We will see. It could really slow things down. There's probably enough places around the country where you could build data centers where people won't object, so they probably won't win out. But it is kind of scary, the number of Republican and Democratic governors who are announcing a slowing down and massive restrictions on data centers, not a complete end to them. Do Luddites always lose? Always lose? No. Here, what is the biggest example? What is the number one example of Luddites winning? Anybody have a good example of Luddites winning? I mean, there are 2.5. There's 1.5 that I can think of. Off the bat, I can think of 1.5. No, I can think of a lot more than 1.5. I can think of more. I can think of quite a few places where Luddites have won. But what's the one obvious one staring us in the face? Well, if you look in the right direction. Well, the obvious one is nuclear energy. Nuclear energy has been ground to a halt. Zero, zilch, nada for what? Since the 1970s, 50 years. Maybe it's coming back now. Maybe, we'll see. And even recently, we saw in Germany shut down nuclear power plants. So in Germany, it's recent, and they're not rebuilding them, even though now they've learned their lesson. So Luddites have completely shut down nuclear. They tried to shut down fossil fuel, but that was too much of a lift. So they only shut it down a little bit. So Germany, place like Germany with no sun and no, it relies on solar and wind. And we have way too much solar and wind in the United States, way more than is justified, because the Luddites won to some extent, at least, on fossil fuels. And then think about the extent to which the Luddites win in biotech. Huge, huge. Cloning. There's almost no research done in cloning. Gene therapies, very difficult to get it done, very difficult for it to be succeeding. Right? So, yeah, I mean, Luddites can win, and they do win. Nuclear energy is something we should really keep in mind. Exit says the CCP, this is in a chat, the CCP and Xi is turning China into Tompkin Village, beautiful skyscrapers with empty and uninhabited interiors, whole cities with no inhabitants. You really need to make sure that that's true. Like, there are a lot of buildings that are being built, whole neighborhoods with no inhabitants because the real estate market's completely collapsed and there was overbuilding and overinvesting in building. But most of the skyscrapers are full. If you go to Shanghai, skyscrapers is all inhabited. I've been hearing about these empty cities and empty skyscrapers for a long time. And when I went to China, I didn't see any of that. But things are getting worse. Things are getting worse. But don't overdo it in the empty stuff. When you go to Shanghai, the place is vibrant and filled with people and filled with energy, and the skyscrapers are filled. Now there are massive real estate developments all over China that are empty because of massive overbuilding that happened, and we saw the real estate collapse in China over the last 6-7 years has been devastating and is devastating in their economy. The economy is doing very badly right now. Very badly right now. But and China's doing very badly right now. China's economy, I wouldn't take China's economy for the American economy at all. I wouldn't take China's economy right now for, I think it's in deep, deep, deep trouble. If America's in deep, deep trouble, China's in deep, deep trouble, in spades. It still hasn't solved the real estate crisis. It's got a massive debt crisis that they haven't resolved. The standard of living, quality of life of individuals in China is declining. In spite of there's no being technically a recession, it's declining. And there's a lot of malinvestment. There's huge amount of investment into areas where they cannot make a profit and ever justify this investment. And there's one other thing I wanted to point out about China, and I can't remember. So yes. So China is, unemployment of young people, 17 to 30, is really high. I mean, massively high, 3 times, 4 times as high as in the United States. So, Iran is backward, completely and utterly a backward place and a backward society and a backward economy and a backward culture. China is forward-looking and aggressive and innovative, but it has a real structural problems and a struggling economy. And I've been to China, and I know a lot of people in China, and I've looked into the Chinese economy in detail. But anybody who thinks that Iran is not backward, modern Iran is not backward, doesn't know anything about Iran and is ignorant of geopolitics. Is ignorant of just not geopolitics, is just ignorant of the place, of the place. Has not studied its history, has not studied what's actually going on. There's not talked to Iranians. It would advantage you to talk to Iranians if you're going to comment on Iranians. All right. Yeah, Jennifer says, I'll just out of order, I'll use this. Look at the growing anti-vax movement. Luddites are gaining ground there. Yeah, I mean, look at the anti-vax HSS, the RFK. I mean, yeah, they're winning. They're winning. Andrew for $50. Why is the right less intellectual than the left? A thought. It's a group who emotionally want to be pro-American, but the altruism, freedom contradiction is so extremely intellectually inconsistent that their patriotism can't be rationally defended. I mean, I think that's true. I think that's true, but it's also true. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why the right is less intellectual. They want freedom and altruism, or they claim they want freedom and altruism, but they can't give up on altruism. And that creates a contradiction which they cannot defend, and it stultifies, it halts their ability to really develop and develop intellectually. But they're also guided by faith, right? The right is also religious. So they undermine their reason with faith. And they have to promote freedom and at the same time promote faith. And faith and freedom are incompatible. They're incompatible epistemologically. Epistemologically, faith requires accepting what commandments, accepting dictates, not through reason, but through fear and through dictate. And so they have the problem of religion. They can't completely embrace technology and science because, what if it contradicts their religion? So the right is less intellectual because religion and altruism. Yes. Right. But I think the altruism freedom connection contradiction is definitely part of it. But you also have to add the faith freedom contradiction. Andrew, I asked this previously, and you asked me to ask again in a couple of weeks. Oh, did you make any new integrations in objectivism or fortify any particular knowledge of the philosophy in preparing for doing your Ayn Rand course? Oh, God. I mean, I don't think so. I think I gained a better appreciation of the epistemology because mostly because I don't think of it that philosophically usually, and I had to think of the problem of universals, and I had to think of what is Ayn Rand's contribution to that, and how solving the problem of universals and is crucial to objectivity, right? The whole idea of objectivity, and then how that is then crucial for the idea of capitalism. Now, I know that in a sense because I read What is Capitalism, and that's all about objectivity. But because I had to present the epistemology and had to talk about the theory of universals, it kind of better integrated for me. I think that's the area. Oh, the other places, And I think it was Greg who really helped me with this, Greg Salmieri, who helped me with this in preparation for this. This is a good point, which I hadn't really. It's something I didn't know. I knew it, but I hadn't made explicit the sense in which everything is the primacy of existence. That is, everything is ultimately goes back to every challenge in philosophy is ultimately goes back to, but what are the facts? Indeed, every challenge in every aspect of life is ultimately, well, but what's in reality? So again, the need to integrate metaphysics into everything else, I think, kept me going back to, in reason, right? So let's take values. And again, this is where Greg was very helpful. In values, like this is an important value to me. And but it has to be consistent with the primacy of existence. That is, it has to factually, in reality, be consistent with my life. It has to truly promote my life. And in that sense, it has to be congruent with reality, with facts, not emotions, not whims, not wishes, not passion. So, people say, follow your passion. No, only if that passion is consistent with what? Reality, facts, with my life, with the needs of my life, which I can only know by looking at reality. So I found, again, not new, but better integrated into every aspect of life. Integrating primacy of existence into every aspect of the philosophy, and then from there into every aspect of life, and consciously, having that as a having that as a theme in Rand's philosophy, in a sense, that integration shouldn't be new, but it was definitely, in a sense, a new integration. I don't know. Hopefully that answers it, Andrew. And of course, I contradicted myself because first I said no, and then now I'm saying yes. I just had to think it through. Shazbot joined late. Even land wouldn't be as much of an asset if it weren't for the backhoe, bulldozer, dump truck, chainsaw, fertilizer, cement mixer. Absolutely. But, for thousands of years, some knowledge had to go into land. You had to know how plants grow, and you need to water it, and what seasons, and what to grow, and what land, and all kinds of knowledge. But there wasn't a lot of innovation. And for thousands of years, there was very little innovation when it came to that. Innovation was very slow. It's only under capitalism that innovation just accelerates. Ooh, we just raised, Super Chat just got to 666, number of the beast. Not a good thing. Somebody should make a quick contribution so we can get off of the 666. All right, Harrison. Not a review request. Those are not $20, but anyone who's interested should give Spade of Sparta a listen. He's a Canadian dude who makes neat music about the American military. Interesting. Spade of Sparta. There's a part 2 to that. I particularly like the song Big E, which is a very energetic tune about the nuclear-powered American supercarrier named Enterprise. All right. Thank you, Harrison. All right, Noah, in response to your answer on multipolarity, I agree with you, but do you think it's true that the USA hegemony in the world is not sustainable as far as blood and treasure, not to mention no political will? I think it's definitely sustainable given treasure and blood, because I don't think it takes much treasure or blood if there's real commitment. I agree with you, there's no political will. But that's what we're trying to argue about. That's what we're trying to reverse. That's what we're trying to debate. That is, The solution is not, okay, there's no political will, so let's advocate for multipolarity. No, the solution is we need to advocate for American polarity, or American superiority, American hegemony, and we need to try to change the political will. I don't have the power to change that. So we're going to get multipolarity. That might be the reality that we get. But that's not the reality we should argue for. It's like the data centers. We might get the surveillance state. But the way to argue for that is not, the way to argue against that is not by suppressing technology. We might get multipolarity, but you don't want to support multipolarity. You want to advocate for American victory. You want to advocate for America's strength. You want to advocate for America's dominance and the political will to do that. Now, if we drive ourselves bankrupt, we won't have the money to do it. And again, we'll get something that's not good. We'll get something worse. We'll get a multipolar world. The point is that multipolarity is not good. It might be inevitable. You might be right. We can't avoid it, but it's not good. Okay, the prophet says 2 questions. Is CFA worth it? If index investing outperforms even finance professional stock picking, what is the more practical finance certification learning for capital allocation in business? Well, I definitely think CFA will teach you how to allocate, well. And look, it's not that even index investing can be done well and can be done poorly. Which indexes do you weight? How do you weight them? What is the most efficient frontier given your risk preferences? All of those are considerations. And then, of course, the only way the market can resemble efficiency, and the only way you can get to a point where indexes beat overwhelmingly most professional stock pickers, is to have professional stock pickers who are beating the market. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't. There are a minority of investment professionals who beat the market, but they are not managing your money. They're not in mutual funds. They're in hedge funds. They're in places where they can be rewarded for their ability to beat the market. So a mutual fund basically pays its investors, the people who run the fund, a salary, and they can give them a bonus, but the bonus cannot be related directly to their performance. A hedge fund, you get 20% of the profits. The better you do, the more money you make. So did Renaissance technologies beat the market? Yeah, hugely, and systematically and consistently. I mean, the guy who ran Renaissance became a billionaire many times over as a consequence. Lots of people out there beat the market, but they don't beat the market in a way that is easy for you to invest. And figuring out who is going to beat the market and who is not is very difficult. Venture capital, for example, beats the market. Now, maybe they don't, maybe it's just a risk reward, but their reward is often so much greater that it's beyond any consideration of risk. Sequoia, over the last 50 years, has beaten the market. Some private equity firms beat the market, some don't. But historically, at least, the ones that are beaten repeatedly, up until 2000 at least, maybe not after that. So it's those people trading that makes the market, for the amateur, impossible to beat. Is the CFA worth it? Depends what you want to do. But yeah, it's a tough test, but having those credentials matters when you're looking for a job. It's a credential, right? And I think it matters when people are hiring. And because the tests are so hard, even if you never use the skills in particular that you learned there, it's an indication that you're smart, that you passed it. Ivlitsky or something I'm celebrating the fact I cracked a tough work assignment today by supporting my values. Thank for all your work. Thank you. I appreciate this being how you celebrate. Love the pro-capitalism content, Kim says. We really need it right now. Thank you, Kim. Andrew, what do you think of the notion of negative freedom? I don't like it because freedom is a positive. Freedom is the ability to live your life based on your values, which is based on your rational thinking. In the absence of coercion and force. But we're not just interested in the absence. We're interested in the action. That is the pursuit of values, the pursuit of rational values. That's why freedom is valuable. So I don't like presenting it in negative terminology. Michael, can you do a show with Alex on data centers? Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll contact Alex. I mean, he's super busy, but hopefully he'll agree to do a show. Michael, leftists regard workers with condescending regard. Leftists regard workers with condescending regard to be guided by the educated. Yes, I think academic leftists particularly regard workers. They look down on them. They don't. It's manual labor. Yuck. Paul, thank you for the point-for-point challenge to this academic pseudo-sophist. How do you pronounce that word? Pablum, something like that. Thanks, Paul. Urban Porcupine, I think my critique of her argument would be that we have no say over the actions of others until our rights are affected. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But that's not enough. I wish it was. That would be easy. We have to convince people of all the little details in addition to that. Frank, is invisible hand sort of like rising tide floats all boats? What does Cordelli say about the cost of the employer or the role of the customer? The customer never appears in what she wrote. At least I don't remember it appearing. So I don't know what she says. And then cost of the employer, I don't know what that means. What's the cost of the employer? She doesn't get into the details. None of these people do. They talk in abstractions. The examples are not very useful. So no, there's nothing about there's nothing about it. Is invisible hand sort of like, it's sort of like rising tide lifts all boats, but it's less visible. The tide you get. Invisible hand is invisible. You don't see how the boats are being lifted. The boats lift by an invisible hand. There can be no, this is Enric, there can be no complete democratic socialism. It's not possible for each individual to vote on every action in society. Socialism requires centralized authorities making decisions for everybody. Yes. And those socialized authorities will be elected democratically, but they still have to make decisions that are not going to be voted on for everything. Although you remember Ross Perot wanted to equip all of us with a button, yes, no button, and that every law that came before Congress would be voted on by everybody. What a disaster. But yes, socialism has to centralize. And, it's like the anarchists, the anarcho-capitalists. It's complete rationalism to assume that you can somehow create this total democracy. It's complete nonsensical. Michael, was Justice Scalia fundamentally a bad guy? I don't know if he's fundamentally a bad guy, but he was not a defender of individual rights. He was super smart. He was a conservative, but it wasn't clear what he wanted to conserve. He wasn't a good guy, but I don't know that he's fundamentally a bad guy. We'd have to define our terms, what we mean here by good and bad. Law and dissent. California can't stop Waymo because California doesn't rule the world. If it did, it could. Force destroys the mind, and its produces partial force equals partial destruction. No way around principle. That's right. But California didn't really try in San Francisco. So they didn't even try to do it. Harrison, how do you feel about a where in the world is Yaron Brook bit where you give us clues about a location and we have to guess where you are this week? Yeah, we can do that. I usually tell you in advance, so it's kind of, I'd have to really hold back on telling you where I'm going and then have a clue. But yeah, we can do that. We can do that. I won't be in Barcelona next week, and we can try and I'll give you clues, and yeah, we can do that. I think I'm not very good at this. I think my clues will be too obvious and you'll guess too quickly. All right, guys, thank you to all the super chatters. Thank you for being with me for 2.5 hours. I appreciate that. Again, this will be a regular feature, this capitalism show, but we'll do more popular podcasts. I'll try to limit the super academics. We'll still do academics because they're really important, but we'll try to do more academics that attack a particular point rather than these floating. And it's good to refute the issues with Marx. So I think what we did today was important, and we'll do more of this type of stuff as well. We'll do a whole variety of stuff. Jason says, I think you'll be in Southern Europe. You'll have to wait until next week when we have I don't know what the prize will be, but when we run a little, when we do this, and I'll give you some clues. All right, guys, have a great weekend. It's Friday night over here. It's Friday afternoon on the East Coast. And I will see you all tomorrow for an AMA at 3 p.m. East Coast time. 3 p.m. East Coast time for the AMA tomorrow. If you a regular monthly contributor at $25 or more, then you should have the link and join us. Bye, everybody.